We're going to continue our Jeffersonian Florida series talking about statehood. March 3rd, 1845, Florida becomes a state in the Union. And the man on your screen, Richard Keith Call, who was a territorial governor, was a leader in Florida, was one of the largest slaveholders in the state, had the Grove Plantation in Leon County, famous now, famous tourist attraction. He was actually not a Democrat. He was a Whig. And he had very different views about economic development than Jeffersonian Floridians did, or Jeffersonians in general did. And so Richard Keith Call was someone who we sometimes get, because of slavery, we in modern times kind of throw people in two baskets: people who were for slavery and people who were against slavery, or some sort of slight nuance on that. But Richard Keith Call, very different than the other elected officials in Florida. And in fact, you had a pretty vibrant Whig party in Florida during the territorial days. Kind of faded in the after the nullification crisis and that sort. A lot of Jacksonians. And the Whig Party ended up becoming very much an anti-Jackson party. Now, what's really important to understand is from 1845 to 1854, the first 10 years of statehood, the Whigs were in very much creating a competitive two-party system in Florida, something that Florida would not see again until the late 1960s. So 1845 to 1854, while Democrats are pretty dominant in most of the South already, they are the party of Andrew Jackson. They are the party of Jeffersonian ideals. They are the party that is more trusted by slaveholders on the slave question. There are lots and lots of Whigs in Florida. And Richard Keith Call is very much the leader of this group. He is very much for internal improvements. He's for bringing the railroad down into Florida and stimulating economic growth that way. He was even an early proponent of maybe building a canal, plowing a canal through the state of Florida to help, man-made canal to help with commerce. Really important figure. And then you also have Edward Cabell, who is on our screen now. He was a Whig who got elected multiple times to the U.S. House in Florida's at-large seat. Florida had only one congressional district, an at-large seat before the Civil War. And he, too, was a Whig. And he, too, was someone who believed very strongly in internal improvements. And he was very much kind of a swing vote in his time in the U.S. House. Now, he was someone that did eventually, I mean, we're going to get to secession next week, but he did eventually serve in the Confederate Army, but had very different opinions about the development of the state. And so Florida had attracted a lot of people, attracted a lot of planters and a lot of people interested in maintaining the slaveocracy, if you want to call it that. Those people tended to be Democrats. There were other people who were in favor of slavery that were slaveholders, but they had different attitudes about economic development. Seeing Florida as a backwater, which it was, seeing Florida as a place that needed infrastructure to stimulate economic growth, perhaps in a way that other southern states didn't. And so that's something that's really important. And I should mention that Richard Keith Call was in office as the territorial governor almost until statehood, and when statehood came around in 1845. So you have significant Whig influence, and I think you look at the Whigs as a true national party, even though there were parts of the South they weren't competitive in. They were a mixed group, the Whigs in Florida. You had planters in it, right? Richard Keith Call, very clearly a planter. You have people who are very much interested in chartering banks and commerce. Andrew Jackson had opposed the Bank of the United States. And let's not forget how hostile to banking Thomas Jefferson was. You had people who were interested in internal improvements, as we talked about. And the primary strength of this was in middle Florida. So really the areas around Tallahassee, Jefferson County, Gadsden County at the time was the strength of the Whig Party. St. Augustine, the emerging city of Jacksonville and Duval County, and Pensacola, those remain solidly Democratic. So ultimately, the Democrats gain an upper hand. The Whigs have their problems nationally, as I think many of our viewers are probably aware of. And you have this man, Stephen Mallory, becomes one of the leaders of the Democratic Party. He is a unabashed champion of slavery, obviously very, very famous. If you go to Key West, there's lots of things named after Mallory. If you go to the University of Florida campus, the hall next to me, it's my freshman year at UF, was called Mallory Hall. Was named for Stephen Mallory. He was a United States Senator from Florida and was from Key West, as I said, and was a leader in kind of Jeffersonian ideals and very much someone who also could build bridges to Whigs, could consider the idea of internal improvements and maybe a banking system and potentially also working through some of the other issues in the state. He was a fierce opponent of the Seminole Indians and wanted the wars and sort of the removal of the Seminoles to be prosecuted to its fullest. And he had a specialty in naval affairs, which ended up being very significant when the Confederacy broke away. But we'll talk about that next week. But he was someone that had a relationship with President Fillmore, who was a Whig with some Democratic sympathies. And after Zachary Taylor passed away, Mallory had increasing influence in the Senate. This gentleman on your screen is David Levy Yulee, who was really kind of the most prominent politician in the early days of statehood in Florida. He was, and there are multiple places named for him, Levy County, Yulee, in Nassau County. David Levy Yulee was a fire eater. He was someone who was an unabashed supporter of slavery. He is someone who was a slaveholder and a secessionist. He was not necessarily even willing to make compromises like the Kansas-Nebraska Act and the Compromise of 1850. He's the first person of Jewish ancestry to be elected to high office in the United States. So that's, although appointed, I guess, really, to the U.S. Senate by the state legislature. But he, a very, very fascinating guy who made tons of money off of sugarcane, cultivating sugarcane around the Homosassa River, what is now Citrus County. Levy County, which the name for him is just to the north. But Yulee was a railroad man also, which is also kind of interesting for a Democrat at the time. He had the railroad plowed through from Fernandina Beach to Cedar Key, which was his area, which is now Levy County. And he had lived in Fernandina for a period, and he had planned to build a state-owned system, which, again, is the sort of internal improvement that a lot of Democrats around the country never agreed with and never wanted to fund. So Florida had its Jeffersonian views, but there are deviations from this Jeffersonianism, which I think is significant in the, I would say, from about 1830 to 1860 until secession. You have these Whig elements. You have this idea of maybe fostering, using government to foster commerce. You have this idea of internal improvements and banking and things that would not characterize Florida after the Civil War. And we're going to get to secession next week. So thank you for watching.